I mended that dress 3 times. 3 times I sat with a needle and thread by candlelight, pulling the seam together like I was. I don't know. Like I was stitching myself shut. Blue cotton, faded at the collar, worn soft at the elbows. It wasn't pretty anymore, not really, but it was mine. And in Tombstone, Arizona territory, in the cold belly of February 1888, that dress was the only thing I owned that wasn't borrowed, earned, or owed. My name is Ada Harper, half-Apache on my mother's side, half-nothing on my father's, because he left before I was old enough to remember his face. Just gone like smoke through a cabin wall. My mother, well, she was mescalero, beautiful woman, strong hands and sad eyes. She married a white miner who promised her the world and delivered exactly none of it. She used to braid my hair at night and whisper, "You carry 2 worlds, little bird. Neither one will claim you." She was right. I understood that prophecy by the time I was 12. I worked at Mrs. Ridley's boarding house on Allen Street, changed sheets that smelled of other people's living, scrubbed floors that other people's boots muddied. I was good at it, the kind of good that means nobody notices you're there. Last Tuesday, the mine superintendent's wife handed her coat to empty air. I was holding it. She looked right through me, said thank you to the wall, and walked on. I hung the coat, brushed off the dust, went back to work. The Valentine's dance at Schiefelin Hall was the biggest night of the year in Tombstone. Miners in clean shirts, ranchers' wives in silk they'd ordered from catalogs, merchants with pomade in their hair and ambition in their smiles. And me, I went every year. Not because I expected anything Lord. No, I went because the day I stopped showing up was the day I agreed with every whisper, every turned shoulder, every woman who gathered her skirt when I passed on the boardwalk. I wouldn't give them that. So I heated the iron, pressed the blue dress flat, brushed my hair that fell too dark and too straight for Tombstone's liking, and pinned it up the way white women did, even though it never quite sat right. I put on the only pair of shoes I owned that didn't have holes, and I walked to Schiefelin Hall in the cold February dark, chin level, steps measured. The boardwalk frost crunched under my feet like tiny bones breaking. I took my chair, third from the wall, next to the punch table, same as always. The fiddles hadn't started yet, but I already knew every song they'd play. I knew how every dance would end with me watching, and nobody watching me. The hall filled up the way it always did, loud and bright and full of people who belonged to each other. Couples found their partners like water finding grooves in rock. Natural, easy. The miners had scrubbed the silver dust from under their fingernails. The ranchers' wives had rouged their cheeks and pinched color into their lips. Even old Doc Harrigan was there, smelling of whiskey and good intentions, tapping his boot to a fiddle that hadn't started playing yet. I watched from my chair. I'd gotten real good at watching. You learn things from the margins, who touches whose arm too long, who laughs too loud, who ain't speaking to who this week. Tombstone's secrets played out on that dance floor like a theater show, and I had the best seat nobody wanted. That's when I noticed him. Grant McCoy, cattle buyer, stayed at Mrs. Ridley's once a month when business brought him through. Quiet man, clean reputation. The kind of man who carried himself like he'd already decided who he was and didn't need the world's opinion on the matter. He was leaning against the far wall, my opposite margin. You might say with a punch glass in his hand, and his silver watch chain catching the lantern light. I knew him, of course. At the boarding house. He was different. He tipped his hat when I passed, said ma'am like he meant it, not like he was performing manners for an audience. Once, when I was carrying a stack of linens taller than my chin, he held a door open, didn't say a word, just held it and nodded, like I was a person, like I was real. Tonight, something shifted. I felt his eyes before I saw them. You know that feeling. When someone's gaze lands on you and stays. Most people's eyes slid off me like water off stone. His didn't. His held. I looked down first. Always did. Safer that way. I watched from under my lashes as two women, respectable women, the banker's daughter and the surveyor's wife, approached him for dances. He declined both. Polite, firm, stayed against his wall. I stayed in my chair. Two people on opposite edges of the same crowded room. And I remember thinking that was a mighty strange place for a man like Grant McCoy to spend a Valentine's dance. Then he set down his punch glass, straightened his coat, and Grant McCoy did something nobody in Tombstone had ever done. He walked toward me. 7 boards. That's the distance between my chair and the side door of Schiefelin Hall. I'd counted them the first night I ever came to a dance, and I'd counted them every time since. 7 boards to the exit, my escape route, memorized like scripture. He was crossing the floor. Every pair of eyes in that hall followed him. I could feel the room shift, feel the attention swing like a lantern beam. My heart was doing something it hadn't done in years, something fast and panicked, like a bird caught in a chimney. I thought pity. That's what this is. Some kind of public charity, or a dare, or maybe he'd had too much punch and, no. His eyes were steady, clear, sober as Sunday morning. He stopped in front of me, extended his hand palm up, fingers open, like an offering, not a demand. And he said, in that low, even voice of his, "Ma'am, I believe this waltz has got your name on it." The air just wouldn't come. My fingers gripped the edge of my chair so hard the wood bit into my palms. "Mr. McCoy," I whispered. "You don't have to. I ain't having to do nothing. Miss Harper." He didn't move, didn't waver. "I'm wanting to." I looked at his hand, looked at the 7 boards to the door, looked at 20 years of practiced invisibility, of mended dresses and downcast eyes, and the careful, exhausting art of taking up no space in a world that wished I'd take up even less. I took his hand. The fiddles played Lorena. You know that song slow, aching, the kind of melody that gets into your chest and stays. His palm was warm against mine, rough with work, but gentle in the way it held. His other hand rested at my waist, respectful, steady, not claiming, just present. And I realized, with a shock that went through me like Winter Creek water, that no one had touched me in years, not casually, not gently, not at all. The warmth of his hand at my waist, it wasn't romantic. Not yet. It was something more basic than that. It was the simple, devastating fact of being held by another human being after so long alone that I'd forgotten what warmth felt like when it came from someone else. We moved through that waltz like 2 people learning a language neither one had spoken before. "Well," he asked about my week. my week, like it mattered. I answered in fragments. Fine, I suppose. And busy, the usual, because nobody had asked me that question in so long, I'd forgotten how to answer it. 3 minutes. That's all a waltz is. 3 minutes of structured intimacy. When the last note faded, he walked me back to my chair. Actually bowed, like I was somebody worth bowing to. I hope you'll save me another, Miss Harper, he said. And then he walked away. Didn't hover, didn't claim, didn't look back for applause. I sat down. Same chair, same spot. But the wood felt different under me. Or maybe I did. Tombstone has a memory like a steel trap. It catches everything and lets go of nothing. By the next morning, the whole town knew that Grant McCoy had danced with the half-breed from the boarding house. The whispers changed shape. They weren't just about me anymore. Now they were about him too. Lost his mind, the men said at the barber's. Pity dance, the women murmured at the mercantile. She must have put some kind of Indian spell on him. Old Mrs. Calloway told anyone who'd listen, and plenty of folks listened. I went back to work like nothing had happened. Sheets, floors, invisible labor, but something was off. The other girls at the boarding house looked at me sideways. Mrs. Ridley watched me with that narrow, calculating expression she usually saved for checking the books. And then Grant arrived for his monthly stay. He came through the front door with his leather travel bag and his hat in his hand. And he treated me exactly the same as he always had. Hat tip. Ma'am? Steady eyes. Except now he lingered. At the hallway table where I set the morning coffee, he'd pause, ask questions, small ones, careful ones, the way you'd approach a skittish horse. How long had I lived in Tombstone? Did I like the work? You ever read anything by that Browning woman? He asked one morning, stirring his coffee slow. Elizabeth Barrett writes poetry that'd make a fence post weep. I hadn't read a book in years. I told him. He said that was a shame. Said he had one in his bag he thought I might take to. Then he asked my real name. Not Ada, the name my mother gave me. Nahazdan, I said, before I could stop myself. It means the earth in my mother's language. I hadn't said it aloud since she died. He repeated it, carefully, got it close enough, didn't make a joke, didn't flinch, just nodded, like he was filing it somewhere important. I started watching him after that, studying him the way you study a trail for signs of danger. He read in the evenings by the parlor lamp. He tipped the kitchen girl a whole $1, and she was just 14 and Mexican, and nobody else tipped her anything. He spoke broken Spanish to the stable boy badly, but earnestly. And once, when a new guest checked in and barked at the boy without learning his name, I heard Grant say, quiet but firm, "His name's Miguel. He's a good hand. You ought to know that." A man who remembered the names other people never bothered to learn. I wasn't sure if that comforted me or frightened me half to death. That night, in my room, I sat in the dark for a long, long time. He'd said my name, my real name, like it was worth the effort of learning. I held that sound in my chest like something I'd stolen. The dust storm hit 2 days later. February in Arizona can turn the sky brown and mean. And this one came howling out of the desert like something with teeth. Shutters bolted, grit seeping under every door, every window, every crack in the plaster. The boarding house emptied, Guests fled to the hotels closer to town center, the ones with better ceiling. Mrs. Ridley retreated to her quarters with a headache and a bottle of cooking sherry she thought nobody knew about. That left me and Grant. We ended up in the kitchen, only warm room in the house, with the stove still burning and the wind screaming outside like it wanted in. I cleaned things that were already clean, wiped the counter 3 times, rearranged the flour tins, swept dust that blew back the moment I turned around. He sat at the table with a book open in his lap that he wasn't reading. I could tell because his eyes weren't moving. The silence pressed. The kind of silence that eventually breaks you open if you let it sit long enough. He broke first. "I had a brother," he said, quiet, not looking at me. "Name was Thomas, 19 years old. Drowned on a cattle drive 6 years ago because I misjudged a river crossing." I stopped sweeping. I told him it was safe. Grant continued. "Current looked manageable from the bank. It wasn't. He went under. And I couldn't reach him. I carry that boy in every decision I make. Every time I assess something cattle, weather, a person's character, I'm really asking myself if I'm wrong again." The wind howled. The candle flickered. I leaned the broom against the wall and sat down across from him. And then I told him about my mother. I don't know why. I mean, I really don't. But the words came out like they'd been waiting behind a door I'd locked so long ago I'd forgotten there was a room behind it. I told him about the Apache woman who married a white miner and belonged to neither world. How she died of fever and loneliness in equal measure. How I learned from her life that love across a line costs everything, and I'd spent 20 years making sure I never paid that price. He didn't try to fix my story, didn't offer comfort or comparison or any of those useless words people throw at grief like dirt on a coffin. He just sat with it, sat with me. The candle burned low between us. My hands unclenched on the table slowly, finger by finger, like something thawing. The storm broke near dawn. Light came in sideways through the dust on the windows. He'd fallen asleep at the table, head on his arms. I covered him with a blanket I usually folded for guests. He wasn't a guest anymore. I didn't know what he was, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The storm cleared, and Tombstone remembered what it was, a town that ran on silver and gossip. And there was plenty of both. Within a week, the whispers had, I don't know. They'd hardened, like mud baked in sun. They weren't just idle talk anymore. They were stones, the kind people throw. Not at your body, no. These folks were more civilized than that. They threw them at your livelihood, at your shelter, at the thin thread that kept you hanging on in a place that never wanted you to begin with. Mrs. Ridley called me into the parlor on a Tuesday morning. She was sitting in her horsehair chair with her hands folded and her mouth set in that line that meant business. Not cruel, I'll give her that. Mrs. Ridley was never cruel. But she was practical the way a butcher is practical. She could cut things cleanly. "Ada?" she said. "A delegation of wives came to see me yesterday." I knew. Of course I knew. They find your association with Mr. McCoy unseemly. They say it reflects poorly on the establishment. She paused. "You're my best worker. You know that. But I can't have respectable women pulling their husbands from my rooms because The help is, well, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have to. I understand, Mrs. Ridley, I said. My voice was even. I'd had a lot of practice keeping my voice even. Keep your distance. That's all I'm asking. All she was asking. Like it was simple. Like cutting away the first real human connection I'd had in years was just housekeeping. I retreated. Old armor, refastened, eyes down, professional distance. The next morning, Grant came to the hallway table for coffee and started to say something. Miss Harper, I was hoping we might, and I felt my mouth open, felt the words rise, and then I swallowed them back down like dry bread and gave him a polite nod and walked away. My hands shook the whole way down the corridor. I pressed them flat against my apron and kept walking. When he lingered at the coffee table after that, I sent the kitchen girl instead. I could see the confusion on his face, the quiet hurt. And God help me, I wanted to explain, wanted to tell him that this wasn't about him. It was about survival, about a woman who couldn't afford to lose the only roof over her head for the sake of a waltz and a dust storm confession. But I didn't, because my mother had chosen love. And it killed her. Maybe not all at once, but surely, slowly, the way desert heat kills not with a single blow, but with 1,000 small thirsts. I made his bed that morning with military corners. Tight, perfect, not a wrinkle. I wanted him to see that I could be professional, that whatever had happened in that kitchen was done. I think he saw something else entirely. I think he saw me locking the door again. That evening, alone in my room above the kitchen, I took out the blue dress. The seam had torn again. Same place. Same thread giving way. Like the fabric itself was tired of being held together. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, with the dress in my lap, and the needle on the windowsill and the moonlight coming in cold and silver through the glass. I didn't pick up the needle. Down below, through the floorboards, I could hear Grant's boots moving through the hallway. Slow, pausing outside the kitchen, then moving on. The front door opened and closed. He was going for a walk, I suppose. Or maybe just leaving the space I'd emptied between us. I sat there and I thought about my mother, about the choices she made loving a man who couldn't love her enough to stay, crossing a line that neither world forgave her for crossing. She'd been brave, braver than me. And what did it get her? A half-breed daughter, a cold cabin, and a fever that took her before she turned 40. I'd spent 20 years learning the opposite lesson. Don't reach. Don't hope. Bull. Don't cross floors that aren't yours. Stay in the margins where it's safe, where the stones can't, where the whispers don't. Well, where you're too small to see. And it worked. I survived. I had a roof, a job, a chair at the dance. I survived. And I told myself that was enough. And this was the thing that kept me sitting there in the dark, holding that torn dress Grant McCoy had said my name, my real name. the one my mother gave me. He'd said it like it was beautiful, like I was something the earth had made on purpose. I remembered his hand at my waist during the waltz. Respectful, steady, present. I remembered covering him with the blanket in the kitchen, and how natural it felt, how my hand had smoothed the fabric over his shoulder without thinking. The way you tend something you already love before your mind catches up to your heart. The needle sat on the windowsill, catching moonlight. The dress sat in my lap, torn open. From somewhere distant, the Crystal Palace. Maybe a piano played something I couldn't name. The world kept moving out there. People kept living. And I really realized, sitting there in that cold little room, that I'd been mending myself into smaller and smaller shapes my whole life, patching over the parts that didn't fit, tucking away the edges that made people uncomfortable, stitching myself shut so nothing could get in, but nothing could get out either. Have I been surviving, or have I been disappearing and calling it strength? I folded the dress with the tear still open, left the needle where it was. Something in me had torn too. And for the first time, I didn't want to stitch it shut. I wanted to see what would grow through the opening. The Cattlemen's Association dinner. Schiefelin Hall again. Same walls, same lanterns, same fiddles waiting in the corner. But tonight I wasn't sitting in the third chair. Tonight I was working carrying trays, clearing plates, wearing the plain work dress of my station. Mrs. Ridley had volunteered me for the service. Probably thought it would remind me of my place. The long table was full of important men, ranchers, cattle buyers, the mine superintendent, a territorial judge passing through, and Grant, sitting near the head, stiff in his formal coat, looking like a man wearing someone else's skin. He caught my eye as I set a plate of bread on the table. Something passed between us fast, wordless, full of everything we'd said in that kitchen and everything we hadn't said since. He started to rise. I shook my head. A tiny movement. Not yet. Not like this. I served. I cleared. I moved through that room the way I'd moved through Tombstone for 20 years present, but invisible. Useful but unseen. The men talked cattle prices and railroad routes and who was selling what to whom. Nobody looked at me. Nobody ever looked at the hands that carried the plates. And something inside me caught fire. Not anger. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't anger. It was like the room got sharper. The edges of everything came into focus. The grain of the wooden tray in my hands. The clink of each fork. The exact distance between me and Grant's chair. 12 steps. I counted them the way I'd once counted 7 boards to the door. Except this time, I wasn't counting toward an exit. I was counting toward something I'd never had the courage to walk toward in my life. I set down the tray. The porcelain clicked against the wood. A small sound. The kind of sound servants aren't supposed to make. I took the first step. My boot heel struck the floor and the sound was louder than it should have been. Or maybe the room had just gotten quieter. Second step. Third. The territorial judge glanced up from his plate. Fourth step. My pulse was in my throat, in my wrists, behind my eyes. Fifth step. Mrs. Ridley appeared in the kitchen doorway. I saw her from the corner of my vision, her mouth opening. Sixth step. Seventh. The men at the table were turning now, one by one, like sunflowers following something they couldn't name. 8th step. I could smell the bay rum on the nearest rancher's collar. 9th step. My hands were shaking, but my feet were steady. 10th, 11th, 12th. I stopped in front of Grant's chair. "Mr. McCoy." My voice came out steady, steadier than I felt. "I need to say something, and I reckon this is the place to say it." The table went silent. Every fork stopped. "I won't pretend," I said. "I won't act like that dance didn't happen, or that storm, or any of it. If knowing me costs you standing in this room, I understand. Truly. But I won't mend myself smaller to fit their comfort. I've done that my whole life. And I'm finished with it." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. Grant stood, slowly, pushed his chair back and walked around the table to where I stood. He took my hand, not pulling me, not claiming me, just holding. He looked at the room. "Miss Harper is my guest this evening," he said. Clear, simple, like he was stating a fact about the weather. "But here's the thing, and I need you to understand this, because it matters. The moment had already happened. It happened at step 1, when my boot hit that floor, when my voice filled that hall, when I chose to be visible instead of safe." Grant's hand was warm. His words were kind, but my feet had already carried me across the floor. I did that. Me, the half-Apache woman from the boarding house who sat in the 3rd chair at every dance. I stood up. Spring came to Tombstone the way it always does, slow, dusty, stubborn. Wildflowers pushing through cracked earth like tiny acts of defiance. The kind of beauty you have to look for, because the desert doesn't hand you anything for free. It had been weeks since the dinner. I still worked at Mrs. Ridley's boarding house. She couldn't afford to lose her best worker. And the complaints quieted once Grant McCoy's business influence became clear. Funny how respectability works in a mining town. Money talks louder than gossip, and gossip talks louder than principle. And principle sits in the corner and waits its turn. But the real change, well, you could see it in my boots, where they walked. Down the center of the boardwalk now, not the edge, not pressed against the building wall, making room for people who never made room for me. The center, my boots on the middle boards, my spine straight. I nodded at the women outside the general store. Some nodded back. Not all. That was fine. I didn't need all of them. I just needed to stop needing their permission to exist. Grant courted me properly the way a man does when he respects the woman he's pursuing. Sunday walks along Toughnut Street, where the cottonwoods were greening. A book of poetry he'd ordered all the way from San Francisco, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He said she reminded him of me. I told him that was the most ridiculous and most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to me. And he laughed that warm laugh of his. And I decided right then that I wanted to hear that sound for a long time. We talked on the boarding house porch in the evenings. Not about big things. Not always. Sometimes just about the weather turning. Or a calf he'd seen at auction that had one blue eye. Or the way the sunset hit the Dragoon Mountains. He didn't try to rescue me from my life. He entered it. And I made room. The spring dance came around. First one since Valentine's night. And I didn't take out the old blue dress. I'd put it away, folded it careful, the tear still open, and set it in the cedar chest. That dress had carried me through years of sitting and waiting and refusing to disappear. It deserved respect. But it belonged to the woman I'd been, not the woman I was becoming. I bought new fabric, deep red, the color of Arizona clay, the color of the earth my mother named me for, Nahasdzan. I sewed that dress with my own hands, and I didn't apologize for a single stitch. Grant and I walked into Schiefelin Hall together, side by side. Not him leading, not me following. Together, the fiddles were tuning up, and the lantern light was golden, and every pair of eyes in that room turned to watch us. He asked for the first waltz. I looked at him, this quiet, steady man who had seen me before I could see myself, and I smiled. I believe I'll take every waltz tonight, Mr. McCoy. He laughed, took my hand, and we stepped onto that floor together. I'd like to tell you the whole town changed overnight, that the whispers stopped and the wives all came around and Tombstone became some kind of paradise. But life doesn't work that way. Some folks never came around. Mrs. Calloway went to her grave convinced I'd put a spell on Grant McCoy. And honestly, maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe being seen is its own kind of magic. But here's what I know. Here's what I learned in that hard, beautiful, unforgiving territory where the dust never really settles and the wildflowers grow anyway. I didn't need someone to save me. I needed someone to see me long enough for me to remember I was worth seeing. The rest, the standing up, the speaking out, the walking down the center of the boardwalk, that was mine. I did that. The fiddles played. I danced. Not because someone crossed the floor for me, though he did. And I'm grateful. And I'll hold that waltz to Lorena in my heart till the day I die, but because I'd finally crossed it for myself. The third chair from the wall sat empty that night. I didn't look back at it once. Valentine. End.